Good afternoon, everyone. I trust you are hearing us clearly. This is Vincent Sweeney, and we are about to start our webinar. We just had a little difficulty in getting a couple of our presenters online. So I want to welcome you all, and just to let you know that today's session is going to be moderated by our Communications and Partnership Officer, Diann Smith, who you would have probably heard from time to time. I just wanted to say welcome and thanks for supporting these webinars and indicate that the two presenters today are pretty well known in the region. One is from our Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean and leads a very large team of professionals that have been supporting the Caribbean in developing and implementing projects for quite a few years. And the other is a very dear friend of mine who's going to be introduced very shortly, Diann Black-Layne, who is well known probably to all of you. She's been in the environment sector for many years in the Caribbean, and she is very well aware of the issues in the region and how to mobilize resources to address those. So I'm looking forward to hearing from both of them, and I want to hand over now to Diann Smith, who is going to take you through the rest of the presentation. Thank you very much, and over to Diann.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And as Mr. Sweeney have mentioned, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our third lunchtime webinar. And we are truly grateful for your support, and we hope that you will continue to find our content very educational and interesting. This month, we're focusing on building resilience in the Caribbean to climate change. And of course, I'm sure we can all agree that climate change is a real and present phenomenon in the Caribbean. And though we aren't major contributors or as major as others, but we face significant risks because of our location and our dependence on natural resources. Interestingly, these discussions are even more crucial now because of what is happening globally. And of course, these will have some direct or indirect impact on our climate resilience. And of course, it's not for any one organization to tackle, but requires joint efforts from governments, private sectors, and even citizens. And this is why this morning we're pleased to present as UNEP, or contributions to climate resilience in the Caribbean, as we work with partners to build a sustainable future. So this morning, our panel will provide us with an introduction to our climate change portfolio, as well as various angles of support that we're offering to islands. And one such example will come to us from Antigua. We invite you to participate by sharing your questions, which we will have our panelists answer as we go into our question and answer segment at the end of the webinar. Our first speaker this afternoon is Gustavo Máñez, who is the Climate Change Coordinator for UNEP Latin America and the Caribbean. At this time, we invite him to share his presentation with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm just gonna share the slides with you. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Not sure it shows well, Diann. Can you just give me a sign if it shows well? The slides can be seen.
Sure, no problem. We're seeing the presentation very well.
Okay, so I'll proceed. So I would like to give you a perspective on how we at the UN Environment Program see the effects of coronavirus, this terrible pandemic and how that links to the climate response ahead of us. Just trying to move in. Sorry, I just got a locked screen. Bear with me, please. Okay. First of all, there is an environmental dimension to this crisis, which it's not only because of the linkages between the pandemic and the pressure on biodiversity and ecosystem resources, which is at the origin of this zoonosis, which is the coronavirus. It's basically how our relationship with nature
We're not hearing you, Gustavo.
Vincent, can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. Secondly, the perspective of waste and how we have to be able to manage all the medical waste, all the hazardous waste that the emergency response is creating. We cannot put that medical waste into the environment because that is going to increase the effects of the pandemic. And therefore, we need to find responses, sustainable responses to dealing with these medical waste. So again, another linkage between the pandemic and the environment. A third component is regional collaboration and obviously global collaboration is important. I mean, we all have seen it, the need of being able to communicate on the health crisis. It is necessary to share information. It is necessary to share the approaches that work. And if we all work together in providing responses, we will be able to tackle both the pandemic and the environmental crisis. So again, this regional cooperation is very important. And that is working to a high degree in the Caribbean. It must be strengthened. And we cannot let this crisis go to waste in terms of just restarting business as usual, because that will put us in a pathway of deeper degradation, and it will create more climate. And we are seeing examples of how if we come back to the business as usual, we'll end up worse. I mean, we're looking at the numbers of emissions in Asia post coronavirus, once the economic reactivation is taking place. And those numbers in terms of, for instance, CO2 emissions have never been seen for the last 10 years. Yeah. So we were thinking that we were managing this crisis, but we're coming back to the climate crisis. So this is an opportunity to include green incentives in the stimulus packages that will be developed post coronavirus. And definitely, this crisis cannot be seen independently from the broader crisis of climate change. We have seen in many countries the lockdowns as a response to the health crisis. But in terms of climate change, lockdowns are not going to save us. And the depth of the impacts of climate change cannot be restored as can be restored a health crisis, despite all the human loss and terrible impacts in human lives. So we must think in that long-term perspective and try to find solutions that at the same time that help us recover the economic activity, they can also help us address climate change. We are also seeing that throughout the region, countries are coming up with economic activation plans, which are putting these countries in higher levels of debt. And when the climate, the next climate disaster, be it a storm, be it a drought, hits us, that's gonna put us in a more difficult situation and in more difficult capacity to respond. And just a few days ago, we were collaborating with the government of El Salvador that has a very strict lockdown and definitely with all the economic impacts that you can imagine. But then it was hit by a tropical storm that left over 40 people that lost their lives and with massive losses to public infrastructure. So this combination of crises, they will put us in a very, very difficult path to recover. Now, we need to acknowledge the problem, and there is a massive problem that we have ahead of us if we combine both coronavirus and the climate crisis, as you well know. But it's also time to focus on solutions. What are the practical actions that we could take to revive the economy, to strengthen the response to climate change, the adaptability, the mitigation activities, and also to create decent jobs? And from the point of view of the United Nations Environment Program, we have put forward 5 main areas of work that have this potential and that have this potential to create a revival of the economy, but also to create jobs and help us adapt and mitigate climate change. And those 5 areas include building resilience in rural populations and the linkage, the nexus between agricultural production and ecosystems through nature-based solutions. The second one addresses how we can build resilience in cities. And most of the population in our region lives in cities. So this is an area where we must focus and must create that resilience also. Accelerating the transition to renewable energy and energy efficiency as a tool to decrease emissions, but also to create jobs. Again, accelerate the transition to a new technology that can also improve air quality and promote health, which is electric mobility. And the 5th component, which is more of a policy or a fiscal policy approach, is how we can gradually reduce fossil fuel subsidies to dedicate these resources to other pressing social needs, and also bring resources to governments by taxing emissions. So let me address one by one these 5 areas and give you concrete examples. On the first opportunity area, the resilience in building resilience in rural populations and agricultural production systems. I mentioned before how the natural fragmentation or the fragmentation of natural habitats and the loss, the encroachment on ecosystems has encouraged the spread of infectious diseases, and this is a reason why we need to come up with a new relationship with nature. The expansion of the agricultural frontier it's at the large expense of natural areas, of ecosystems. But at the same time, by doing that, and because of climate change, food security and rural livelihoods are threatened. Droughts, storms, cyclones, etc., etc. So this approach is not working. Now, nature-based solutions based on nature, are cost-effective tools to increase agricultural productivity, but at the same time manage that
Gustavo, wait, I'm hearing you.
Sorry?
Now it's back. We weren't hearing you a second ago.
Sorry, I do not hear you so well. May I proceed?
Sure, yes, we're hearing you.
So just to give you an example, from the Global Commission on Adaptation, investments between $250 and $500 per hectare in nature-based solutions in dry areas for agricultural production, they increased yields between 70 and 140%, providing more jobs in the meantime. So this is an example of how these approaches can increase resilience and can create more jobs. And there are different examples of nature-based solutions applied to agricultural production, such as land restoration, such as sustainable grazing practices and agro-silvopastoral systems, etc., etc. The second high opportunity area that should be considered when designing recovery packages post-coronavirus is the resilience in cities, also through the application of nature-based solutions. And we do have many examples throughout the region of how building resilience in cities through green infrastructure can facilitate protection of, for instance, storm waters, drainage, protection of coastlines from sea level rises, and protection of water sources. And I know that the traditional way in which many of the cities in the region have adapted have been focused on green infrastructure, but when you combine green infrastructure gray infrastructure, but when you combine gray traditional infrastructure with green infrastructure, a higher adaptation to climate and the climate-proof infrastructure, the cost. So sustainable drainage systems using and on the meantime, they can create more jobs, more employment opportunities. And there are many examples of these green infrastructure approaches that have been applied in cities throughout the region and that should be promoted as part of these recovery packages. The third opportunity area, the accelerated. We just published a report calculating what would happen in the entire Latin American and Caribbean region if by 2050 we are able to move to renewable energy as the only source of electricity production. And the numbers are astonishing. Up to 35 million jobs can be created by moving to a fully renewable energy matrix. And savings of electricity bills could be reduced by more than 280 billion US dollars. And there are studies which analyzed how the response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where did that money go? And for every money of spending, every $1 million of spending in these recovery packages in this past crisis, 7 jobs were created in renewable energy, 7 jobs were created in energy efficiency, and for that same amount of money, only 2 jobs were created in the fossil fuel industry. So it is an industry that can generate more employment opportunities. It can make the economies more competitive, and it does make economic sense. So this is another high opportunity area. Just to give you another example in terms of job creation that we have supported through a project in Mexico, about $1 billion investment in Mexico over the last few years in distributed solar energy, mostly from private sector, but also through some public support, has created about 9,000 jobs and more than 200 new small and medium enterprises in the solar distributed solar energy sector. So it is a source of economic activity to promote renewable energy. The fourth high impact opportunity is the transition to electric mobility, and by doing so, promoting cleaner air and more health. And there have been various studies throughout the world in the last few months showing that the deaths caused by COVID-19 are higher in those cities which are highly polluted. And therefore, that provides an additional rationale to accelerate the transition to electric mobility. But also, as part of the report I was mentioning to you before, that we did for the whole of Latin America and Caribbean, we also analyzed what would mean by 2050 a complete electrification of the transport system, mainly vehicle road transport, excluding planes, excluding ships, etc. And that electrification of the transport system could create up to 5 million additional jobs. Jobs not only in the production of vehicles, we're talking also about the installation of charging stations, the improvement of networks, and all the ecosystem around electric mobility. And there are very interesting business models around the region, and very good examples. I'm thinking about the examples of public transport systems throughout the Caribbean that are starting to move to electric buses, but also a vibrant private sector movement, for instance, in Barbados, but also in other countries along electric mobility. And just to give you a few numbers, these come from Latin American cities, but they are highly, highly relevant here. We calculated what would happen in terms of avoiding premature deaths if the transport in 5 Latin American cities moved to electric mobility. And as you can see there, just in these 5 cities, Buenos Aires, Santiago, San Jose, Mexico City, and Cali, they could prevent by 2050 up to 435,000 premature deaths by moving just this cleaner technology. And lastly, as I was mentioning before, in this context where the public sector is going to be stretched in its resources to respond to the social and health crisis and economic crisis of coronavirus, there's going to be need for financial resources in the private sector. Now, this is the opportunity to reduce or eliminate gradually energy subsidies to fossil fuels, for instance, which throughout Latin America and the Caribbean represent about 2% of the annual GDP. And this is a great opportunity because as you know, the fossil fuel prices are at its lowest in the last 30 years. So this is the opportunity to reduce that or to eliminate those subsidies and not have a big impact in citizens and businesses. And at the same time, it's also the time to consider imposing carbon taxes in a well-designed and socially sensitive manner to increase revenues for government and send the signal to the markets that only those technologies which are clean and which are non-emitters are to be allowed in the future. This is just an example of Indonesia, which in the last 5 years phased out all its subsidies in transport and electricity, saving about $15 billion, which were then reinvested into social plans, into education, into poverty reduction and construction of infrastructure. This is an opportunity to do that. And just to conclude, this response, apart from providing technical solutions, will also require from governments new modus operandi and new development of new partnerships, because the sheer amount of resources that will be necessary to recover the economy and to make it work again will be too big, and public resources are not enough for that. Partnerships with the private sector and commercial banks are needed to put in place all these solutions, but not at any cost. And we have examples of how banks are putting in place sustainable taxonomies that indicate those areas where they will be investing, and where those areas which are not sustainable in the short and long term and therefore must be avoided. This is very important to explore how these sustainable taxonomies could be put in place throughout the region. And also other measures such as the swaps debt for climate protection should be explored. And this economic depression should not be an excuse for reducing environmental and climate standards based on the pressure to kickstart the economy again. So we must be very aware of these lobbies from traditional sectors. Let me just conclude by saying that we have seen a decrease in emissions between 7 and 8% in this pandemic. And in a report we published at the end of last year, the emissions gap report, we calculated that in order to be on the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement, we would be needing to decrease our emissions yearly between 2020 and 2030 between 7.5%. So what we have seen with coronavirus, avoid catastrophic crisis. Solutions such as the ones that we have presented just before, we're not going to be able to control that. and to adapt mostly to the climate crisis that is already here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gustavo, for sharing with us. It was certainly
over to you, Diann.
Sure, with lots of things to think about and high opportunity areas. So this afternoon, we turn over to our second speaker, who is the Chief Environment Officer and focal point for the Global Environment Facility in Antigua and Barbuda. She works out of the Department of Environment, which is the focal point for the Global Climate Fund projects. And she is Diann Black-Layne, and she will be sharing with us an example of a project from Antigua and Barbuda. So over to you, Diann.
Hi, you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to make this presentation. It's a pleasure to do so, and hi to everyone who is. So Antigua and Barbuda has been working with UNEP, I think, almost since 2006 on most of our GEF portfolio. And working with UNEP, we started to look at some of the issues that the previous presenter had talked about in terms of climate change adaptation and resilience building. Antigua and Barbuda is prone naturally to drought and prone, of course, we're in the hurricane belt. But we have noticed an increase in frequency and length and severity of drought. And of course, we have increased and the intensity of hurricanes. So we are not, most of our climate finance funding is spent on resilience building. But we have started to move to mitigation. And in our mitigation program with UNEP, we mostly design our project to have a coupling of sectors, to have multiple benefits. So, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. So that's, we don't have a pure resilience project. We try to find that area in between so we can maximize the funding that we have. So two of our major projects with UNEP that is doing exactly that. We have, of course, our SCCF project, we call it that. That's not the name of the project. It has a nice long name. But that project is designed to build resilience in a community. So what we thought is that instead of, we have a small amount of funds, it's a $5 million project. It'll be difficult to spread that around the whole of Antigua. It will have not a lot of impact. So we identified a community that has several key vulnerabilities and exposure to hazards. And that was the McKinnon's community. And in that community, we're looking at flooding, flood prevention by doing some intervention in the upper watershed area. The project is also looking at providing loans, low interest rate loans to homeowners in the community to get their homes ready for hurricanes and drought. And the project also provides, for those persons who are living in rental communities, they will be able to, sorry, they'll be able to shelter in hurricane shelters. So the project provides some funding, some grant funding to develop hurricane shelters. The project also has a big focus on ecosystem-based adaptation measures that we're using. It focuses a lot on using traditional Antiguan methods, going back to the traditional way of preparing and getting ready for hurricanes. We had moved away from that since the frequency of hurricanes had dropped. And now that it's becoming more frequent and it's becoming more expensive to import, for example, shuttles from Miami, so that persons, I'm sorry, the air conditioner is bothering my throat. So persons are now looking at what the old time people used to do and old time communities used to do, and we're going back to those kind of low cost, as we heard about earlier, low cost measures. We also worked with UNEP, which we are grateful to UNEP to listen and hear us. When we told them we wanted to have move towards making the operations of the project themselves a resilient way, and respect our climate change principles. So for example, on that particular project, we had funding to purchase 2 vehicles, and both vehicles purchased were electric vehicles. So this project brought to the DOE our first electric vehicles to any government agencies in Antigua and Barbuda. So, so far the project is moving along really well, and we've partnered with the government to work with the flooding, the flood reduction, and we started doing the work in that area, and almost immediately we saw an immediate reduction in flooding for that particular site. There's a long way to go, however, and we're now programming the loans, and the loans are going to be be provided to recipient maybe in August this year. The grants for the churches and the community buildings are in conjunction with another project, but the SECF project with UNEP provided the standards for the building standard and the building code for these buildings for the community. So that's one project. The other project that we're working on that is focused a lot on ecosystem-based adaptation is what we call the SPEAR project. It's a sustainable financing project for protected area system. And one of the reasons why this site was selected as a protected area is that it can provide adaptation benefits to the communities that in this particular area in the southern part of the island. The basic business model of this project was to install solar panels and wind turbines in the protected area and then sell that electricity to the grid or to the government agencies or to off-takers. That project is ongoing, and that was the first project of its kind that I know in the region. And we had some delays just by technical issues, but we're on our way back. We're back up and running on that particular project. So that project is going to install about 5 megawatts of electricity for sale to the electricity company. We anticipate that that should be wind and solar that is grid interactive. What that means is, grid interactive. What that would mean is that, as indicated in the previous presentation, because Antigua and Barbuda is prone to hurricanes and drought, when hurricanes come, the grid is down. So most Antiguans to become resilient need backup energy system. So this electricity that we're generating will be, generating electricity directly to the reverse osmosis plant in Antigua and Barbuda, so that even when the grid is down, the plant can continue to generate water. That type of electricity connecting to the grid, as opposed to grid tied, is much more expensive, and so this is why we're only receiving 4 to 5 megawatts of electricity. If we had done grid tied, we would have received maybe on the order of 8 or 9. But when the grid is down, we will now still have water. When the grid is down, the business model will still make money, because when the grid is down, the electricity company does not make money because they cannot provide electricity to people. So the community will still be able, the protected area will still be able to provide electricity to the utility so that they can still generate water. If they're still generating water during a hurricane period or after a hurricane period, which means that they can still at least sell water. So some of the financial risks that many of our companies face after a storm or during a drought, like our farms, we're working with them to get grid interactive energy so that they can have backup energy system all the time. But as you know, grid interactive energy is not backup energy, it's become your primary energy. And this is one of the risks to the project, is that the utility company is not happy about that at all. So that is causing, we're not getting the full support of the utility company, but there's no way around that. We're not here to replace the utility company. The idea behind the project is to build resilience. And right now, if you depend on any utility in our region, as you would have seen in San Juan after Hurricane Maria, that if you don't have a generator, you don't have backup energy system, then you cannot rely on the grid. So those are our two main projects for implementation that we're working on with UNEP. We also work with UNEP on our national communications. And in our national communications, we prepare a lot of the policy documents and collect a lot of the baseline information that we need so that we can actually prepare projects. So when working with UNEP, we actually look at our national communication rather than just a mere reporting tool, which is annoying. You know, you have to produce these reports. We actually use that process to develop a lot of the data collection and complete a lot of our technical work that we need to complete that can be useful for reporting as well as for project development. Finally, so we have enabling activities, we have full-size project. The project that we're working on, the first one I spoke to you, and the second one, the two projects that we're working on with UNEP. I'm pleased to say that we're already working with the Green Climate Fund to scale up those two projects. So in summary, the portfolio projects we have with UNEP are basically ranging from data collection, baseline data, capacity building. The enabling activities give us an opportunity to really go out and provide outreach and lobby for and do a lot of the technical work. There's a lot of misinformation out there about renewable energy, how much it costs, does it really work? It's still out here in our community. And so I think we have accomplished the idea is almost debunked that it is not going to work. So we're happy for that. We also have the project implementation with UNEP, and we also have scaling up as a result of our interaction with UNEP. And I'll just close with this final thing. The project that we're sending to the Green Climate Fund, that we're now on the development for the Green Climate Fund, is a sector coupling project that would look at electricity and the electric vehicles, where you will have bidirectional charging for vehicles that we're going to be testing as something that we could use the vehicle as the generator for about 54 government buildings. So we get a lot of support from our UNEP team in Jamaica. Thank you, Vincent, and your team, as well as, of course, Panama and Nairobi. So I think most of these projects we're working on are new, and we're working very hard here in Antigua to ensure that we can share our lessons learned and we monitor them, and we can see replication throughout the region. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Diann, for sharing with us this evening or this afternoon. I see one question. I think it's for Gustavo. And you can please feel free to share any other questions that you have as well. It says, in Indonesia, they reinvested into social plans and education. What was the outcome in terms of reduced poverty, child morbidity, literacy, etc.? Gustavo, would you like to take that question?
Yes, thank you very much. The reform in Indonesia basically accrued savings of about 15 billion US dollars from fuel subsidies. And while there was no formal reallocation of the subsidies, the budget, the national budget, was increased in three main areas. One of them was the transfer to regional governments and cities or villages. Another one was, and that was for about 1.6 billion. Another one was for 12 billion for ministries in working on special programs such as health insurance, housing for low-income groups, and providing clean water solutions. And about 4 billion additionally were allocated to state-owned enterprises for investments on infrastructure. We have not analyzed what are the impacts of these in terms of the outcome in terms of reduced poverty, child morbidity, etc. But this is a topic that should be definitely looked deeper. But there is a correlation between how these resources can then be allocated to these other social needs, as we've seen. And I have shared with all of you the link of the IISD report done within the framework of a G20 program where Indonesia actually moved on with this action. I hope this can answer partly this question.
Thank you, certainly, Gustavo. To Diann, I have two questions. The first one is there any public-private partnership agreement with APUA in Antigua which would incentivize persons to invest in renewable energy?
Right now, most of the electricity generated and used by the utility, which is APUA, is our local utility, is generated by one private sector investor. APUA itself only generates maybe around 25% of the electricity that it has. So the government is considering, and we're working with Climate Analytics as well as IRENA to prepare a proposal to the government for a 90% fossil fuel phase out. With the 90% fossil fuel phase out, the APUA will be forced to diversify their partnership with the private sector, but we're not sure how that would be generated right now. If you consider a homeowner as a private sector, the APUA do have policy that homeowners can generate their own electricity up to 5 kilowatt systems. After that, you have to put it into the grid and out. The APUA does not pay you for your RA system that you put. If you have excess, they will give you just a credit. So it's not very investment friendly. However, it is, if you have electricity, if you need backup energy, so an Antiguan energy system is the energy that you use all the time, plus you would need a capacity to generate energy when the grid is down. So you would pay for the grid plus a backup generator. When you look at that business model and the cost of having both, that redundancy, right now it is cheap to get solar panels and battery systems. So what we're seeing here at the department with the loans that we have for the FCCF project, the UNEP FCCF project with us here, is that many people, as poor as you think, are actually requesting solar panels and battery systems. So in Antigua, small public-private partnerships are difficult here in our small market, but the private sector is definitely involved in the sense that they will be investing in their own renewable energy system. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. I see two more questions for you. So the first is for data collection. Are you using UNSPCC templates that you modify, or do you have your own platform and database that you use? Then use queries on how to support the MEA reports and at the same time contribute to justification of proposals.
Okay, thank you for that question. Use the UNFCCC template. I'm not an expert on the greenhouse gases because I don't agree with it, but anyway, so we definitely use the UNFCCC template, and however, the UNFCCC reporting template is not necessarily what the donors want to see, like what a project developer like the Green Climate Fund would want to see. So we actually have to use a different methodology to calculate like greenhouse gases averted for Green Climate Fund project, for example. But you know, we have to report the way that the UNFCCC wants us to report, which is what we do. And so we actually have to invest in doing it two different ways. One, the way that the funders would like to see, and the other way that the Climate Change Convention want to see. I don't know if Aria, you know how we negotiate the greenhouse gas data collection at the UNFCCC. It's really quite funny. So what you get at the end of the day, sometimes it's not practical, but that's a negotiated product Whereas for the GCF and so on, they want to see something that is logical and it has you can quantify the economic impacts as well. So, and that's a difference we note.
Great. So the final question that I see here is, how is COVID affecting your plans? You spoke of building hurricane shelters. How are you adapting to bring social distancing into the mix, especially in the light of the new cases in Antigua?
Right. Thanks for that. So right now in Antigua, we have about 30-something designated shelters. Many of them are like schools and big buildings in the community and so on. So what we're doing for our project, which is a bit more expensive, is that we're actually, first of all, trying to get people to stay at home. This is beyond COVID-19. A lot of things can go wrong when you have way too much people in a shelter. And so we believe that a shelter should not have more than 40 persons. So if we use, that is what we use as our standard. So if we use that as a standard, we are saying that we will provide grants to as many churches, as many small schools, and buildings that are available and would want to serve as a shelter to allow them to serve as shelters. The grants would be used to make sure that if you are to build ramps to enhance the building to make sure it's a category 5, and also have backup energy system. And we would not support generators, we only support renewable energy system. We're also saying to persons who are going to those shelters, if it's a church you attend, you can register at the church you attend, which is not what happens right now. So what you would not find 10 years from now, we're hoping, is projected down, 10 years from now, is that you would not be going into a shelter with people that you don't know or community that you don't know about. So these are people that you normally would hang out with. So you wouldn't have crossing of communities. If you have parents are in a senior home that you can shelter there with them, for example. So we're expanding the idea of what a shelter could be. And actually what we're doing is saying most Antiguans don't shelter in a government-run shelter. Most Antiguans would literally go to a home of a friend or family and shelter there. So that is the model that most of us prefer. And so we want to take that idea, capture it, and use that as the model for our hurricane shelters, where you have no more than 40 persons entering. So that is what we decided, not necessarily for COVID-19 as a health issue, but as a social issue to ensure that we can reduce, any violence or any potential difficulties that especially women and girls and their children would probably encounter at some place. And then most people, because they're very much afraid of that, they literally don't go to a shelter. So they will stay at their home, which it could be rented. And so they have no control over what the landlord will do to the house. And then they will be exposed because they're afraid. So we're changing that culture so that it's a place that you would want to go. It's a place that you would know with people that you already know. So this is what we're doing. But yes, COVID-19 definitely is a factor here.
We do want to say thank you to both of you, both Gustavo and Diann, for participating in our webinar today and for answering the questions. You both did a very beautiful job in sharing with our audience today on the various aspects of your work. Thank you so much too to our audience for joining us. And this is it from me. I will hand over now to Mr. Sweeney for his closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Diann. And again, thanks to the participants as well as to the audience. We're competing with the ending of the OECS Environment Ministers meeting today, and I know a number of us on this call had to switch from one to the other and probably haven't even had lunch, which might explain the lower than usual participant numbers. But we want to encourage you to please put in your calendar in advance, even if you haven't received the specifics. But the last Wednesday of every month, we will, for the rest of the year, we'll be having a webinar on a different topic. usually around the same time, 12:30 Jamaica time, 1:30 Eastern Caribbean time. So if you could put it in your calendar, then you'll be reminded, so you won't book anything else during that time. But thanks again to my colleagues Gustavo and Diann, two of the let's say experts in our region who certainly can answer pretty much all the questions you would have wanted to ask on the topics. And we value your partnership, Diann, as you know, and look forward to working with all of you as we try to address resilience in the Caribbean, particularly challenged now by COVID-19. So thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon. Keep safe, and we will certainly be in touch again. And if you have any interest in the presentations, please send an email to us, and I'm sure we'll be able to get those. Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.